Thank you guys very much for having a quick tea. We're running late, but what we're going to do is we're still going to try to keep the panel at an hour and a half, and it's going to eat into lunch a bit, so quicker lunch, which I know is not possible, even though Lynda assures me it is. I just want to say a personal apology to Rashida again. She accidentally stumbled into my lecture somewhere very far from here, and I thought she was a first-year student, and I ordered her into a seat, and she sat through my whole lecture. It was so fun too, though. It's okay. So just real sorry, and yeah, don't come into my lecture. It's paid in a hurry. So we're going to get on with it. The panel is on vulnerabilities, and we have a range of different papers on that. And what we're hoping as well is, I've asked the panelists to have a shorter presentation than they usually do, for us to have a more robust discussion on the kinds of vulnerabilities we face as women of color and black feminists. Whether they do so or not, we'll see. I mean, in terms of keeping to time. But yeah, let's just start with Lynda Gichanda's thing. So I say your name, say it.
That's right. Thank you so much. We've just changed the schedule very briefly, and mainly because one of the reasons that I approached, both of us approached Sipokazi to be one of our keynotes, is because I really like her work, and her work speaks to my work, except that I use literary texts to say what she says so adequately. So Grace felt that it would be nice to just have that kind of follow-up immediately from the keynote. And when she was speaking, I was like, oh gosh, this is what I'm doing. So my talk is called Vulnerable Subjectivities in Kagiso Molope, Dancing in the Dust, and Nadifa Mohamed's The Orchard of Lost Souls. The Orchard of Lost, Kagiso Molope's Dancing in the Dust and Orchard of Lost Souls, and I'm just going to cut their names now, are feminist revisionist accounts that explore the active participation of young women during the repressive regimes of South Africa and Somalia, respectively. Through the representation of two female characters, Molope and Mohamed's narrative of a fictional reconstruction of young girls' stories of conflict, which consciously insert and privilege the horrifying experiences that women are subjected to during times of conflict and war. These vulnerable storylines portray some of the horrendous stories of abuse, fear, and humiliation that women detainees had to withstand during detention, where they were subjected to interrogation and physical and mental and emotional torture. The novels illustrate how the two female characters' growing dissatisfaction with the repressive regimes see them joining underground student organizations. However, their participation in a political mass demonstration subsequently leads to their arrest and detention. Through the fictionalized representation of incarceration and torture, Molope and Mohamed depict the traumatic experiences that the protagonists have to undergo. The paper focuses on the depiction of these various vulnerabilities that young girls are exposed to during these times of repression. I argue that vulnerable subjectivities portrayed in these two books offer us alternative ways of understanding how young female victims and survivors of torture struggle to reimagine other selves that transcend the oppressive regimes that seek to destroy them. Molope wrote Dancing because she realized that post-apartheid history and literature were silent about or neglecting to chronicle the stories of children and women. She notes that nothing had been written about the black female child during apartheid. Even when people talked about detention, it was a completely different experience for women than for men. I needed to get those women's stories out. The protagonist rightly observes that the information about women freedom fighters was hard to come by, yet I knew from my experience that there were many of us from many different age groups. By focusing on the traumatic experiences of a young black girl, Molope successfully fills in the silences that were left by official versions of history during apartheid by reflecting on the experiences of thousands of children whose childhoods and indeed lives ended too soon and whose stories were never told. Molope's narrative, which I argue is a feminist one, is an assertion that clearly articulates young women's agency in the struggle. Setting the turbulent times of the 1980s in a township, possibly in the north of Pretoria, the coming-of-age story is narrated in the first person by the protagonist, Tielo Massimo. By the time she's 15, Tielo, her mother Komotso, and her sister Kate Mitzi have all personally experienced the brutality of the apartheid regime. In the novel, Tielo transports the reader back to when she was a 13-year-old naive schoolgirl, and she you see her as a naive schoolgirl, watching TV and just doing all these things that teenagers are supposed to do, until one day she realizes that there's something going out on the streets. Orchard is set between 1987 and 88 at the height of the Civil War. In this paper, I focus on Hoda, the only living daughter of Koso, who in turn is one of the protagonists of the novel. It is through Koso that we learn about Hodan's story. Unlike Tielo, who tells us her story and who is actively involved in the struggle, Hodan accidentally gets pulled into a protest march when ordinary school children take to the streets to demonstrate against the sentencing to death of 10 doctors whose only crime is to organize a cleanup of a hospital. The state apparatus deploys the police and soldiers to arrest hundreds of school children who were remanded in prison at the police station. After 3 days, Hodan is released into the custody of her mother. From the moment she's released, Koso immediately notices the difference in her daughter. Hodan was pat out, looking no better than a street girl. Her face was filthy, her hair matted. She rushed into the shower at home, not bothering to heat the water on the stove, and then fell asleep in the bed they shared. In addition to being disheveled, she chooses not to speak. Instead, she tries to physically erase her experiences of prison. Once she falls asleep, because she does not say anything, Koso creeps into her bed and slides the sheet gently and checks her body for injuries. There were small bruises on her thighs, 4 on each leg, the size and shape of grapes. She replaced the sheets and squeezed her into her arms, hoping against hope that what she feared hadn't happened. Over time, Hodan continues to build a solid wall of silence. When Koso tries to find out what happened in prison, she refuses to reveal any of the details. Nothing, Hodan said. Nothing at all? Didn't they interrogate you? Just a few questions, not much. In an attempt to return to some form of normalcy, Koso suggests that Hodan goes back to school. But she is adamant, I'm not going back to school. Why not? I don't want to see any of them. But they all went through what you went through. Leave me alone, Hoyo, leave me alone. Koso watches helplessly as her daughter washes her sticky hands again and again in the bathroom and felt all language had left her. Since Hodan refuses to speak about her experiences, the reader can only imagine what Hodan goes through. While for Tielo, during the detention, her body is subjected to physical assault and unbearable atrocities. For Tielo, narrating functions as a means to deal with her trauma, as well as healing and finding a sense of healing and restoring a sense of self. Although their experiences may be similar, the way in which they deal with their trauma is different. But I'd also argue that both girls are not devoid of agency. Through these teenage characters, both Molope and Mohamed foreground and problematize the forgotten and untold stories of young girls. In the process, they restore the roles of invisible girls in visible wars. In detention, 14-year-old Tielo encounters the absurdity and ruthlessness of the police, who use rampant torture and interrogation to inflict and instill terror. From the first day, the viciousness of the police is relentless. She recalls the threatening manner of a policewoman who instructs the female detainees to put their faces against a wall and take off their clothes. She yells, "Bend over, we're going to search you." But much to Tiello's astonishment, there were men with gloves on, opening women's battles. In Orchard, Filson, one of the protagonists, is a female soldier. But more importantly, this depiction destabilizes the notion of feminine communities by offering an alternative way to read the various experiences that women are exposed to during times of political instability. The portrayal of gender and the nation state demonstrates that women call youth and are complicit in the oppression of other women, and they end up creating unholy alliances with patriarchal nationalist structures. According to Beth Goldberg and Sheila Menkins, women also perpetrated violence. It was not only the preserve of men. In their capacities as officers of the state, women perpetrated institutionalized violence. However, by using the policemen to conduct this common routine, it violates their bodies. Women's vulnerability is exposed and they're left feeling humiliated and traumatized. Institutionalized torture is an oppressive tool used by regimes to exert power and control. The way in which torture functions is to strip away subjectivity and agency and not to extract information. All these actions are meant to physically and mentally destroy Tielo, yet she tenaciously refuses to confess. Her silence acts as a form of resistance. Because of Tielo's silent resistance, the torturers resort to physical torture to inflict pain. She is assaulted and forced to undergo water torture. But when electric shock is administered on her body, and she describes it as first my breasts and then my back, it burned like nothing I had ever felt before. I thought I was going to die. I was going
Gaga.
I'll still take on these titles, I shall. I want to talk about trafficked bodies today as vulnerable bodies. But I want us to think about the meaning of vulnerability in this context, and I'm quite happy about the keynotes that we've listened to so far, because in many ways they make it possible for my paper to happen. I look at two novels, Abidemi Sanusi's Ayo and Chika Onigo's On Black Sister Street. Some of you heard about that yesterday. And I want to examine the theme of imagining Europe through the trope of vulnerability. I delve into the narratives of the lives of 5 women and the entanglements with violent pasts that persist into the present. Within contexts of precarity, I consider what an escape to Europe offers or promises to those who supposedly leave their problems behind. These include escape from poverty, joblessness, and violence, and the possible embrace of wealth, social standing, and general well-being. However, the things that these women desire remain persistently elusive because of the vulnerability of the violent pasts and their presence. I explore their vulnerability against a broader background of memory and narration of violence. In doing this, I trouble the meanings of vulnerability and create possibilities for engaging with the lives of those who are trafficked in ways that render them present and visible. I also explore ideas of survival and resistance within these extreme conditions. I take vulnerability to mean exposure to danger, hurt, pain, and violence. Yet I also read vulnerability as a form of action of survival and protest. Vulnerability here would suggest a discomfort, a troubling, a form of knowing, a facing of fears, and a form of protest. Bakler, in her work, urges us to think of vulnerability as an opportunity to resist the precarity of life. Exposing the body to vulnerability makes it possible to expose oneself to pain and other effects. A form of questioning is born out of taking risk and being unsettled in the face of violence. If being vulnerable allows one to gather the will to live, to survive, and to endure, then reading the trafficked body as a marker of survival is a way of unthinking a narrative of victimhood in which the trafficked body is invariably caught. My reading does not in any way negate the violence that happens upon the trafficked body in the novels. However, it is a deliberate attempt to read the novels in a way that signals a methodological shift that acknowledges the place of affective modes of encounter and experiences as guiding principles into reading both novels. It is to try and resist falling into a trap of reading Eyo, Sisi, Ama, Efe, and Joyce as objects for mapping the terrain of vulnerability. I recognize their located or spatial experiences as modes of reading the violence around them. On this, I echo Danai Mupotsa's call for feminist epistemology in order to avoid essentialist and oversimplified analysis of Black women's bodies. Rather, as she suggests, a theoretical standpoint that does the work of centralizing a marginalized figure inevitably encourages a reading against dominant perceptions of these figures. I hope to tease out some of the thoughts I've outlined above through a reading of Aeon and Black Sister Street to engage both the complexities of African women's experiences, women who travel to Europe with and through their bodies. These women who willingly or unwillingly become trapped in the horrors of human trafficking. Ayo, for instance, is sent to the UK to serve as a nanny by her father with the aid of his friend. Unfortunately, the violent context in which she exists comes undone and she ends up being a sex slave. Throughout her travels, Ayo is never in control of her body. As a child, she remains vulnerable to all forms of violence because of this. In the case of the women in Unigwe's novel, Sisi, Ama, Efe, and Joyce, they all find themselves in Europe through a man called Dele. While three of them, except Joyce, go to Europe willingly, they are hopeful for a dream that will take them away from the squalor and indignity of their present existence. In all their cases, violence of poverty, of sexual attacks, and sheer dominance of patriarchal power define the past context from which they come. Traveling to Europe rather than alleviate the violence brings that same violence into sharp focus. From the isolated existence that these foreign bodies are thrown into physical harm, into the quiet threat of the Madame, of Dele, of Shegun. These are the people the human traffickers who are involved in their movement, who want their cut in the trafficking trade. Indeed, when Dele orders the murder of Sisi, one of the women, it is to make his mark as the puppet master and to remind those who work for him to never cross him. In this extreme context of violence, what does survival and resilience look like? So I reflect on this. Literature on violence against women and children suggests that the violence occurs principally because of the subordinated positions of victims. Violence renders bodies vulnerable and open to abuse. The sheer ability to survive and continue to live in full recognition of what the trauma means on one's body is extremely important. I think about the feminist scholarship as public therapy in this case. The work of Black feminists such as Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, Pumla Dineo Ola, to name a few, give us vocabulary for thinking about alternative epistemologies, which encourage new formulations for thinking about knowledge. Using Black feminist phenomenology, I engage with the context in which the violence shapes the lives of these characters that are in the novels that I want to review. I may not have enough time to go through the synopsis of the novels, but just to give you a sense of what this is. Ayo is a 10-year-old whose multiple violences, Ayo is a 10-year-old who has multiple experiences of violence. By the time she reaches 10, she has experienced what probably an adult woman would have experienced. She is exposed to so the reader is exposed to excessive emotion and pain to evoke Now you confused me with just 6 minutes. Okay. All right. So I just need to think about what this child is going through, both in her context where she lives in Nigeria, and eventually when she's transported to Europe. So it is, what the author does is the author makes us think about what that violence looks like right from the time that Ayo is a child, all right? And never a child, okay? Because she's 10, but she's treated as though she's a grown woman. Her father routinely rapes her. Her mother hears this rape happening, never does anything about it, pretends, and at one point tells the daughter, you have to endure, we also went through this. So this is the kind of violence that Ayo is coming from, and travels to Europe and thinks she's going to get a chance to be a child, she's going to go to school because this is what is sold to her. And the minute she arrives, the person who picks her up from the airport immediately signals that this is not what's going to happen, because he puts his hand on her thigh and looks at her and says nothing, of course. But Ayo immediately knows what this means. And of course, in the weeks that come, in the months that come, during the day, Ayo is a nanny, not just to the woman that she works for, but to a whole neighborhood of Black African immigrants who now, have been told there's a child, there's a nanny in the neighborhood and you guys can bring. So she becomes this person who does this labor during the day, and at night, the man of the house routinely rapes her and eventually outsources her body, and so she's constantly being raped by all sorts of people. By the time she's 13, she's this disconnected figure. The women in Sanusi's, so that's Sanusi. So the women in Unigwe's novels equally are exposed to this violence variously in their past. There's one of them who's raped at the age of 8, from the age of 8 until she's 13 by her pastor dad, father. And the only reason the father stops raping her is because she has her period, her first period, and pretends that this never happened. And when she finally raises it 10 years later, he throws her out of his house. So these are the kinds of violences that these women have to face. So what then I think about in this paper is what I call the reassurance of narrative, the reassurance of narrativity. So in her analysis on Black Sister Street, Daria Tanka categorizes the narrative's characters as both subjective to their conditions but also agentic. She engages with the task of balancing the narrative between the two positions and comments on how the author, using narrative fragmentation, achieves a nuanced engagement with human trafficking. Narrative, as Tanka argues, enables exploration of humanity and its many complexities. My time up? Oh, I still have 3 minutes. It is from this location that one can rethink vulnerability as a trope in the two novels. Feminist theorists identify vulnerability as a feminized concept associated with weakness and dependency, and for me this was quite important, because then if we're thinking about vulnerability as this feminized concept, then how can we use that same concept to drive critical thinking around the possibility of pushing back, of survival? And I think that's part of why I appreciate the 2 keynotes that were given. Okay, so I think I'll stop there, because I think what I'll say anyway after this is really just a reiteration of the point that I'm trying to make, that I want us to think about vulnerability as a position of agency. What does that look like, and how can we begin to theorize that in a much more forceful way? I'll leave it at that. I'm scared of showing.
Next up, we have Dr. Nwabisa. Bangeni. Dr. Nwabisa Bangeni from Stellenbosch University.
My paper is titled Textual Vulnerability in Candice Derman's Indescribable. Candice Derman's memoir, titled Indescribable, It's Easy to Keep a Bad Secret, generates discord. It unsettles because of the narrative choices she makes to tell her story of sexual violation. In narrating how her stepfather sexually abused her, she uses the experiencing child's voice, and in the course of the narrative, matures from an 8-year-old to an angry 16-year-old, and in the epilogue, an almost 36-year-old woman and wife who resists labels of victim and survivor. The narrative voice encapsulates the young child's conflicted experience of a secret adult sexual world created by her stepfather, whom she loves, and the language that she uses underscores the incongruity of her life as a child with a secret life of sexual violation. Candice Derman writes of the sustained rape by her stepfather as an abnormal normal. She instinctively knows that she does not like it, but has come to accept that it is what happens between them. The fact of Derman's sexual abuse was shocking when her memoir was published, because South Africa knew her as an actress in the youth drama set in an art school, the soapy titled Backstage, which was one of ETV's premier soap operas in the 1990s. She was also an actress on Generations, one of the most popular soap operas on South African television, and she was also in ETV's soapy Scandal. The script of Derman as a successful actor did not coincide with the emerging script of her as having lived through what she described to a boy that she's dating when she's 16. My stepfather abused me. It started when I was 8. At first it began with him touching me, and then he raped me when I was 11. It carried on until I was nearly 15. And I have to say this, that I'm saying this fully aware that nobody's life story or life script should coincide with acts of sexual violence perpetrated on them. But this is also how we react on hearing stories of sexual violence daily, particularly personalities whose lives we know differently from television or from public life. And of which we only know a part, we only know what we see, and we think that's the total sum of their lives, when it is not. Her successful public life belied the reality of her abuse, even as news media continue to demonstrate daily that sexual violence is a pandemic in this country. The prevalence and rise of rape and sexual violence in South Africa is known intimately. It is often the most urgent concern and question when we discuss incidents such as housebreaking and car hijacking, as violent confrontations tend to devolve into rape in those instances. Women, we know now, have become afraid to get into near-empty taxis, amongst many other fears. The other abnormal normal is reading Derman's childhood trauma narrated in a voice and style that are so different from the reflective manner of the woman who conducted interviews on radio when she launched her book in 2010. And then I also have to say that I say this fully aware of the manner in which we, as the public, demand certain reactions of people who report sexual violence has been committed to or on them. I suppose I want to report and reflect on my own conditioned responses as a way of checking how I participate in the vilification of victims and survivors of sexual violence, even through a private reaction to a radio interview. I mean, I didn't speak to anybody, but I was surprised and shocked. But I'm aware of how that tends to play out when we have these discussions in public forums. The narrative voice alters almost imperceptibly as the account progresses, reflecting her developing maturity as a young girl and as a sexually maturing adult, even though she's still a teenager. These selves grow in a parallel and separate trajectory, but also rage against each other as she breaks the silence when she is 15 and lets her sister know of their stepfather's unceasing sexual abuse. The voice in which she writes renders her vulnerable. Sexual violation is a daily affair for her, and her silence is causing her untold damage. A different kind of vulnerability is tangible in the final chapters of the book, and anger comes through in her teens, and even more so when she is exposed to Joe's abuse, that's her stepfather. And her mother begins another relationship, bringing a new man in her life while she is trying to rebuild her life. She's angry at her mother, she's coming to terms with the betrayal by Joe, whom she loved throughout the abuse, but the narrative pace is slower. There's a calmness that contrasts the bewildering revelation of the early chapters of the memoir. The bewilderment throughout the novel is largely the reader's, because Derman's child voice and perspective is very matter of fact, and it's characterized by the irony of the adult author, and which renders the reader vulnerable because the accusatory finger points at the reader and at society. How does this happen on your watch? I read Derman's act of writing this book as an act that challenges institutions that are supposed to safeguard and protect the vulnerable, and in her case it is her family and the social bodies where she is unable to find acceptance as a sense of acceptable behavior is warped. This is at the school, in the drama societies in which she takes part, in the church, and various institutions that she goes to, and people don't understand why she's behaving the way she's behaving when she thinks it's so obvious. You should know because this is what's happening to me. The act of writing is from an agentic position where she is foregrounding the failure of institutions that are supposed to protect and yet fail her at a time when she needed safeguarding. Derman asks a number of times in her book how the adults around her could fail to see that something was very wrong. Writing is also an act of resistance, a political action that implicates adulthood as complicit in her being rendered vulnerable as a child. It is an act that positions the reader in a vulnerable position, largely in response to her account, which is characterized by relentless details of what Joe does to her. And then again, I need to say that sometimes I think that vulnerability on the part of the reader seems very self-indulgent, but it's also how I felt when I read the book. I felt exposed and I felt unable to answer some of the questions that she posed as to where was everybody when this is happening to me. She writes in a style where revelations are not dependent on or made significant by plot structure, characterization, or setting, but are amplified by the voice of her younger self, whose narration is largely devoid of obvious adult reflection and analysis. She just tells you, hits you with fact after fact or detail after detail of what she experienced. Her disbelief is mostly evident in the use of irony. It seems as though she largely leaves judgment of her father to the reader, but she dwells in the shame that she feels for her increasingly awakening sexuality, that she feels very shameful about. The child narrator asks questions and points a finger that demands answers, which implicate the reader as part of the social and political institutions whose failings are being laid bare. The reader's vulnerability can be located in the space, in the accusation made by the child. The intense relationship is between Derman, the author, and the readers, because her family, and even Joe, the perpetrator, is not as implicated. Candice Derman introduces herself in the very first sentence of the memoir as follows. My name is Candice Derman. I'm 8 years old and I live in Johannesburg, South Africa. Yesterday I kissed my girlfriend like I was a boy. My tongue went into her mouth. It felt wet, naughty, nice, wrong. I like swimming. I like swimming parties. I like swimming parties, spare ribs, and cats. My mom got divorced. My father moved out, but I'm not sad. He was always cross and slept a lot. My mom's getting remarried. I'm so excited about my new dad. He gives me so much attention. The attention feels good when he's not touching me there. I'm 8. I love my sisters, playing, and puppies. I know it's wrong what he's doing. Tomorrow he will stop. I know it. And that's how she begins the book. And I think for the rest of the 3 minutes, I just want to read excerpts from the book, and perhaps I'll talk about them when we have the discussion. I'm very excited about Joe and Mommy getting married. He's going to be my new dad. I can't wait. And the day he is very good. He's very, very good. And I try to forget about the night when he's very, very bad. After the wedding, he'll stop because I'll be his daughter. From this moment on, I refer to Joe as dad and my real dad as Lionel. That's just what happened. I had no choice. My new dad tells me he has always wanted a daughter and I'm the perfect one. He tells me I'm smart, funny, and talented. I tell him he's the best father in the world. We have connected and I'm excited. I've never felt this before. I don't think my real dad loved me, but my new dad does. I can feel it all the time. Lucky me. Lucky 8-year-old me. And that's part of the irony I identify, because as the adult she can write lucky me, lucky 8-year-old me, knowing that she was not lucky. But that's how she felt as a child. And when she's 10 years old, she writes, the big 10. Hello world, it's me, Candice. I'm a tiny bit taller, my hair is a little longer, and my eyes, well, I'm not sure. I try not to look into them, but they do seem bluer. Everybody tells me I'm blooming. I'm becoming aware of how good looks can get you further in life. This is not going unnoticed by Dad, and he's starting to enjoy the new me. Maybe one day I'll understand this, but right now all my prettiness seems to do is to make Dad want to hurt me. My relationship with Dad has gone from strength to strength. We have a few games we like to play, grabbing my hair and banging my head on the table. That's the first one. The second one is love bites. And the third one is drowning in the pool. And then she goes on to describe what those games look like. And she talks about how she feels when her dad does those things. And I also talk about the structure of the plot, which is largely temporal, because each chapter is titled for the age that she is when she writes of those experiences. Time is up. And okay, so I feel that the book advocates for those that find themselves silenced, because sexual violence is silencing. Her narrative choices, particularly voice and perspective, make her childhood such an inhospitable place to inhabit. The steady, almost detached, childlike accounts of her horror are a call for the reader to be vulnerable and to effect change, because inside the mind of the abused person rages a torment that cannot settle neatly into any categories of expected behavior. An ethics of care is based on the notion of reciprocity between the caregiver and the recipient of that care. Derman's book is a confrontation. It asks how abuse continues for such an extended period of time without people noticing. It asks of us to reassess some of the notions we hold about how abuse presents itself, because it might not be in the ways or in the places one expects. And more important in her assertion in the final chapter of the book is how she wants to be viewed, not as a victim, not as a survivor, but a wife and a woman. She ends her story by claiming a new history for herself, not erasing the past, but by moving past it. This stance is also instructive in how society practices that ethics of care that for for each individual or for all the stories, our responses will be different because their relationships to their experiences hold different meanings for them.
Next up we have Professor Grace Musila from Rhodes University.
Okay, so thanks so much, Sharlene and Lynda, for this wonderful feast of ideas. I'm really having a lot of time, so thanks a lot. My paper reflects on 3 case studies which interlace death and laughter through the use of popular music and dance to make commentary on 3 tragic moments in contemporary histories in South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya. And I'm interested in the ambivalence of laughter as a response to these moments of vulnerability, brutality, and death. What I'm looking at is the complicated appeal of these musical tracks and dance moves as aesthetically appealing and in some instances even erotic, yet at the same time signaling surrender to the life-denying power of the state. It's a very long paper, so I'm going to only focus on the Nigerian segment of it, and hopefully time will permit and we'll get to see it. So I'm very interested in Black people's relationship to laughter, and part of the beginning of this paper, 2 beginnings which have nothing to do with the material I'm looking at right now, is that one beginning is when a friend pondered how one begins to make sense of a Facebook update that says, that awkward moment when your mother dies. So I start with that, I'm still trying to figure out what happens there. And then a second beginning, which is less morbid but equally bizarre, was asking myself how we wrap our heads around a Kenyan lawyer called Dola Indidis, who took strong exception to the unfair prosecution of Jesus Christ, that he decided to sue Emperor Tiberius, Pontius Pilate, and King Herod, among others, at the High Court in Kenya in 2007. The Kenyan courts referred the matter to the International Criminal Court in July 2013. But I was very struck by the obviousness of this lawsuit because I just wondered, why hadn't anybody thought about this before? And never mind the fact that accused number 1, Emperor Tiberius, is long dead and probably long forgiven by Christ. And I expect he's also forgiven Pontius Pilate and King Herod. And never mind also that not so small detail, the fact that God himself authorized the unfair trial and death of his son as an act of divine grace. Despite this, or as they say, irregardless, Dola Indidis and the group called the Friends of Jesus took serious umbrage to what they called the abuse of Jesus' human rights. And so as good friends of Jesus, they're standing up for Jesus' rights. So they're suing Pontius Pilate for judicial misconduct, abuse of office, bias, and prejudice. They're also suing the Republic of Rome and the State of Israel for their complicity in Jesus' malicious prosecution. And the general idea here is to have the trial of Jesus declared null and void, following a similar precedent in the overturning of the unfair trial of John of Arc. And so the Christian in me gets stuck somewhere here. I mean, it's all good that John of Arc got posthumous justice, but what would it mean for Jesus' trial and crucifixion to be rendered null and void? But absurd as this sounds, anyone who has read Black writing will know that Black people's seeming absurdities are not always a light affair. It's funny in that funny, sad way that explains why Louis Armstrong's fans could call him fondly Satchmo, as in Satchel Mouth, as a loving nickname. It's this contradictory blend of hurt, humor, and affirmation that's a reminder of Black people's laughter as a celebration of the grey ambiguities of life, in full recognition of the fact that life and death are next door neighbors. So are pain and laughter. So these anecdotes are examples of what Dola Goldstein terms laughter out of place, in reference to humorous, dark, and ironic commentary under cruel circumstances. And I open my discussion with these encounters with Black people's laughter as a way of framing the slippery ambiguity of the laughter inscribed in the 3 case studies I explore in my paper, which feature a similar recalibration of death and laughter through multimedia and digital remixing of brutal news reports to make satirical commentary on three tragic moments in contemporary histories of Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. And the cases in point are the murder of a young man by police on the streets of Nairobi in 2007. This was remixed into a song, which became a ringtone, which became a popular track, and eventually, yet it's a called murder execution style of a young man on the streets of Nairobi. So it became this popular trend, and there were ringtones all over the country around this. The second example is the 2012 massacre of the 34 miners by the police at Lorde in Marikana, which was repackaged into a satirical song by Musila. And that's widely available, so I'm interested in that repackaging of that material. And thirdly, the Nigerian First Lady Patience Jonathan's emotional breakdown at a public meeting in Nigeria following the abduction of the 274 students by the Boko Haram, that's the Chibok girls case. So I'm interested in the use of remixing and elements of the carnivalesque as vehicles of humorous commentary on the brutality of state power in Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. So humor scholarship has often debated the question of the agency of laughter and the limited acknowledgement of the moral ambiguities that mark what Ebenezer Obarzari, in a different context, describes as the wide range of morally ambiguous actors, entrepreneurs, and classes that inhabit the interlocking realms of state and society. And what I find interesting for my purposes is Obarzari's conception of humor as doing the work of recognizing, rejecting, and enduring suffering. So I find that useful in making sense of Black people's capacity to laugh at and with violence as something complicated there. So I think Obarzari's reading offers a nuanced handle on the ambiguities and contradictions inherent in strands of African humor, whose logics exceed what a sharp moral dyad or emphasis on agency and resistance can capture. The advent of digital media and the infinite possibilities of remixes, as exemplified in the three cases in discussion, invite us to reconsider the agency debate in humor scholarship and pay closer attention to moral ambiguity and the role of humor in recognizing, rejecting, and enduring suffering, and the centrality of suffering in contemporary African humor, specifically the cases I'm looking at, in a way speak to humor's recalibrated function of mediating resilience and endurance in the context of what Patrick Chabal describes as constant and arbitrary suffering at the hands of state officials whose abuses of power without effective censure, both actively through violence but also passively through neglect. And I think cases like the Isidimeni tragedy are a wonderful example of the violence of the state via neglect. And these are examples of the ways in which ordinary citizens are rendered vulnerable to the whims of the state. So Chabal's application of resilience in his discussion resonates with Goldstein's idea of hard laughter, and she defines hard laughter as, in a way, involving a running commentary about the political and economic structures that make up the context within which people try to make their lives despite the circumstances they find themselves in. And for her, then, it's important, this analysis of the work of hard laughter is important because it reveals the ambiguity, contradiction, paradoxes, and the inconsistencies and multiple interpretations of the world that ordinary people try to articulate. I'm also drawing on Mikhail Bakhtin's work on carnival and the grotesque, and people who've reread Bakhtin's work in relation to internet cultures and digital platforms of remixing as enabling different forms of the carnivalesque. Sharlene is not here, is she? Oh, you're there! I was thinking I could sneak a few extra minutes. Thank you. This is the example that I'm looking at. I'll only show you a very small clip of this. And that's the then Nigerian First Lady, Patience Jonathan.
Jay, help us. There is God. There is God, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God, oh.
Okay. I'll keep it brief and we can play it longer at a later point if time permits. So this was remixed there's so many remixes and commentaries on this, and one of the ones I'm looking at is this. By the militant group Boko Haram. Outrage swept across the world, and soon the case, which came to be abbreviated as the Chibok Girls case in transnational public memory, became the focus of extensive social media activism under the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls. As information trickled in, it emerged that the Nigerian military had 4 hours advance warning about the impending attack, but they were unable to use this intelligence reportedly because they were stretched too thin and lacked the resources to foil the abductions. It also emerged that the West African Examinations Council had directed the school to ensure that there was adequate security during the examinations period, but the school failed to do so. So on her visit and public address to the school, First Lady Patience Jonathan registered her frustration with the circumstances surrounding the abduction of the girls and the seeming inefficiency of the school's teachers. Her remarks descended into a teary breakdown in full view of the cameras broadcasting the proceedings. And so there was this long interview, or rather press conference on TV, where she breaks down into tears, and the moment that then gets repackaged is when she says, you know, Chai, there is God, there's God in everything that we're doing. So this incident was broadcast on Nigerian TV news channels and widely circulated on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook. The First Lady's emotional response struck many Nigerians as hypocritical, given the fact that the president only made a public response to the abduction of the girls close to 3 weeks after the fact. And also, given the fact that at an earlier meeting with the mothers of the missing girls, 2 days after her husband's acknowledgement, the First Lady was quoted as saying, we Nigerian women are saying there's no child that's missing in Borno State. If any child is missing, let the governor go and look for them. There's nothing we can do about it. She explained that the president's delayed response is owing to the couple's initial belief that no girls had been abducted, and in fact this was simply a ruse to undermine the president's reputation. So after this emotional address, several music and dance videos and skits mushroomed across the internet parodying the First Lady's emotional appeal to God, her uncertain English interspersed with pidgin, and the irony of her outrage at the inefficiencies in the school, when the country itself is mired in inefficiencies under her husband's leadership. The emotional breakdown was reconfigured in a range of texts. In a range of texts, including a song track by the Nigerian duo P-Square. It's called Personally, must be familiar with some of us, with grotesque latex puppets dancing to it, but set to the same tune. So I will just, Shah says time is up, so I will just conclude if she permits me. So I'm looking at the ways in which Audre thinks about laughter as both a form of state critique, but also a form of self-critique. And the ways in which part of the work that laughter does is to pose questions to ourselves about our complicities and our ways of indulging forms of abuse that actually undermine ordinary people's dignity. But at the same time, for our purposes, I'm interested in the ways in which, although the latex puppets offer an explicit satirization of the presidency, this particular text is far more ambivalent in its messaging, because here, with the 3 generic dance clips from the internet, clearly drawn from other contexts, interspersed with the First Lady's utterances in her own words, in her own voice, but set to an upbeat dance bit. The dancer's suggestive dancing offers a visual palette that stands in sharp contrast with the crying First Lady in the lyrics, capturing the creator's eloquent dismissal of the emotional breakdown, but also evoking a very deep ambivalence in view of the possible sexual exploitation of their abducted girls, which again speaks to Dina's work earlier on human trafficking, because that was a major concern about the Chibok girls. So what does it mean for us, for this material to be repackaged in very erotic visual and musical, sonic template, so to speak, when at the back of our minds we also have this concern around the possibility of these girls ending up in human trafficking circles. And so the ambivalence has been pervasive as the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls got repurposed to other comic ends, most recently, well not so recently, but a while back with a photoshopped picture of the American First Lady, Michelle Obama, holding a placard with the legend, Bring Back My Speech, following the scandal of the incoming First Lady's reported plagiarizing of her speech. So what do we do with this repurposing of news that was initially about a very tragic case into different forms of laughter?
Okay, so I like double speak, so there'll be two things happening. Thank you to the panel. The first time, I initially said I would do Feeling and Ugly, because the first time we did this panel was the first time I ever read from the draft of Feeling and Ugly, and I just read. And it was the first time I was in like at a university reading poetry, and like, so I love these people for letting me do things. So my gratitude to be here again. What I want to do is I'm working on, I'm going to talk through a preface of a project, a biography of Audre Lorde in relation to South Africa. And so I'm going to, sorry. The order here is not the same order as mine. It's fine. So I'm going to speak to it in my own way. I came to Audre Lorde as a 17-year-old, as a university student. Like many people, I hadn't been, I'd had a whole education where black women somehow had never written books. And so she's one of the first people I read who was a black woman as a university student in a women's studies class. And so part of how I come to her is reading Sister outside her. I'd never known, it's like when I read it, it's like I'd known what she was saying, but I'd never known what she was saying. So this kind of knowledge that you know but you don't know. She's been a companion of mine since that life. When I read Zami, for example, and spelling my name, it was like the figures in her work were these kind of apparitions, possessions that I'd always known, part of my own collective knowledge, but I don't know the spaces she's talking about. So one of the opening frames I have to think about her, and this is instead of letters that I didn't realize how poor you could see, the kinds of conversations, also thinking simple things like writing letters, so reading Zami, and but also reading Sister Outside and thinking about letter writing, which has been a long practice in feminist work. But thinking about my own practice of letter writing in high school and the kinds of intimate relation, friendships, meanness, you know, the kind of cruel letters you used to write each other in high school, also like the mean ones. Thinking about the range of relations that letters produce, becoming instructive in terms of how I think about the body of work. This is the body of work that Lorde has produced, including a volume last year, a new collection, a lot of it collections of poetry, some collections of essays and speeches, and then one biography of her own. And then there's a lot of biographies people have rewritten on their own, coming from where they're coming from, either concerned with the transnational question of where she fits transnationally, or in relation to herself. So often it's like me and Audre Lorde. So there's a range of biographies of her life, but also she rewrites her own sort of biography. So thinking about that, what that frame means and does. I'm now doing my thing that doesn't fit together. So I'm recollecting my texts, which are not matching. So I'm sitting in the archive in Berlin. So one of the first frames for me is to begin with is that with Lorde's work, like all feminist work, it begins the personal, political, the beginning as the location where one sits becomes the site around which any kind of dense action or thinking begins. So that makes sense to think about the body of work on Lorde as well as her own work in a particular kind of way. But then I'm like a well-trained social scientist, so I go to the archive in Berlin and I start to piece through some of these documents that I'm showing you. And part of what happens in terms of that, in terms of what the intuition of what real knowledge is, or how we can come to know sort of the value of a person's life in any kind of context, begins with thinking about, like, you go to the archive and then you learn, and then the archive will tell you. So that's what this is. But also what that means in terms of thinking more broadly about questions of how social history is written, how biographies are written, in particular in South Africa, which is what was so powerful for me about the keynote this morning, in terms of undermining some of the usual habits of fact-checking, or what parts of a life one prioritizes when ascribing value to a life in and of itself. I know, like, I'm so sorry, I didn't that match. And these are initial drafts of like the last collection of marvelous arithmetics of distance, which finally is published after her death. Part of what I think about what happens in the archive that's important in terms of this frame. So I listened for hours to a conversation between her. She was on a panel at the first International Book Fair, Feminist Book Fair in Toronto with Miriam Sadi. And the panel begins, they do their thing. What does it mean to do feminist work across difference, across contexts? And Miriam Sadi is like really angry. She's like, actually, me, I left on an exit permit. You came here on an American passport. The conversation actually begins from that context, and it's a very angry conversation with a range of other interlocutors about what it means to begin to think about a Black feminist position in ethics and intimacy and friendship, and difference and the work of distance. And so I find this, and I'm like, that's interesting and would be interesting to be published. I find traces of her friendship with Ellen Kuzwayo, including a range of, like, strange in the photographs that you think no one will ever see because you're like in the lounge in your clothes that no one should ever see, but now they're in an archive. I find traces of her relationships with a range of underground movements, both in and outside in exile in South Africa, but also in other countries, various kinds of social movements. So those are the legitimate routes one could take to claim the value of a person's life in a particular kind of context. And I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about how often that's mobilized in certain ways, but I'm also immediately aware of, I think because of this particular moment, I'm in the archive in Berlin, how she's been productive for Afropeans to be like, oh, Africa and Black. And so the particular way she's mobilized transnationally, again, in this relationship to the I. And this is, so I was thinking these are legitimate ways to think about how to frame her life in this context. But also then I'm thinking about the other frames that I could think about, and that's I think what I'll conclude with, and I'm going to use in particular a conversation between me and Mangile Gacho. Mangile Gacho is one of the three women who runs Imperial Press. They're the ones who published Feeling Ugly. She's a poet. She was once here at this university where she did an MFA, which is now published as Red Cotton, which is a collection of poetry. More broadly, there are other interlocutors, but for the sake of time, I'm only thinking of Wangi. And in particular, to think about what it means to write love letters methodologically, or to work with different forms of maps that aren't caught in the habits of tracing connections in a particular kind of way. Thinking, for instance, that there's a lot of work on the naming of Zami, biomythography, Zami being a patois translation of les amis, like friends, again, another continuing what intimate friendship means or implies. To do research about women's lives, to think about the productive, building things about friendship, but also the really harmful ways that female friendships, the harmful things that female friendships also continue to produce. And these are also rich ways to revisit some of Lorde's key concepts like difference, like solidarity, like what it means to love in difficult ways. To think about her relationship, for example, with her own mother, and where and how it reappears, which is something then I was thinking about For instance, when you were reading yesterday, the range of poems to our mothers. In terms of that, in terms of the figures who appear in the work continuously, the kinds of ways we also deal with the family and the friend, thinking about the kinds of speaking or not to speak, the function of muteness, a function of silence, what forms of utterance are actually a possession and not speaking on our own terms or our own behalf through the kind of liberal subject we often assume, what genealogies we claim, how difficult it can be to confess, even things like, I feel like I'm the only person who doesn't publicly say Mam Winnie, because I just can't do it, my body refuses. And so even the difficulty of those figures in terms of like Winnie, sorry, I can be that person. So to think about this conversation with the range of poets in here, the case we have Rangi in more specific ways. As a final frame, there's people like Humla, who's just spoken, Habiba Badaroon, Barbara Boswell, who've had really productive ways about thinking about Black women's poetic writing in the present. But what does it mean to take out the context of the present and the value of the present, or presentness, in terms of actually thinking about these continuities? So to undo the temporality of the post-transition or post-war, as we've learned today, as a mobilizing frame for why the value of a life comes to exist. Again, here I'm thinking about the productive ways that undoing of the presentness or that frame of temporality of linear time, in terms of thinking about biography or memory or the present or ongoing lives of people. Another frame of the use of the erotic, again through the lens of friendship. What does it mean about dense citation, claiming intellectual genealogies, writing these letters, anticipating your kin, but also extending the question more broadly about what it means to publish, which of course is part of the conversation about somebody who does publish, starts a publishing house, and also part of Afems' conversation anyway, right? Okay. Finally, beyond the myth comes the dream. In terms of a method, so the method of the myth would be, say, for example, using stories that have gained traction over time. So there's lots of mythology in Lorde's work, and lots of mythology that reappears. So we often go to myths as a way to re-engage past. So if we re-mythologize the place of women, then we can somehow account for the present in a particular way. And there's a way that myths are preoccupied everywhere in Gancho's work. Not Gancho, in Lorde's work, but also part of it is also dreams. And the temporality of a dream is less backward looking to kind of gain traction in the present, or less authoritative, but it forms a kind of method of knowing that that is intentional and accessing the collective unconscious. 1 minute left. So to think about forms of writing, or the frames by which a life becomes present through a form of ritual, writing, talking across one another, or what Dina Ligaga calls breathing underwater, which makes sense to people who know what that means. So I'll conclude there. I have one more slide. And that's it. I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Okay, as you can see, we are severely over time because the next panel should be beginning just now. But we're going to take 10 minutes to just have you discuss with the panel. We had wanted to have more lively discussions with the participants, but I think it's more important for you guys to get an opportunity to address them.
Sorry. More for Grace, right? The laughter thing, right? I was wondering while you were presenting whether or not laughter has also become a way for us to survive, like to wash things off, rather than to, I don't know, you know? Like, I think like I think we've been taught so much how to be brave and to be proud, that accepting the realities of what's happening kind of exposes our weaknesses, so it's easy to just laugh and brush it off and deal with it in your own kind of time, right? When you're ready. I don't know, it's just a comment.
I have a comment, question thing for Lynda, who's looking at me very disapprovingly. So I'll take that as encouragement then. Lynda, I'm wondering whether what you're doing with Mohamed and Molope, and I mean I agree with what you're saying about the specific ways in which they engage with the invisibilization of certain kinds of kind of public activist and historical work by black women in post-war situations. I wonder though whether they aren't also engaging even more so, perhaps equally so, with the trope of, and the difficulties and the traps and the violence, of course, of heroic masculinity, right, as authorizing trope for legitimate memories of struggle and liberation. Am I making sense? So you were saying that part of what Molope is doing in writing DLO and writing all of these complicated ways of entering into activism and doing activist work and becoming visible as certain specific kinds of visibility in post-apartheid writing, but that is actually mnemonic about apartheid South Africa, was about writing these black women into visibility. And I'm saying I wonder whether it may not make more sense to think about Molope as doing, I know what she says, but you and I are literary scholars, and we listen and completely disregard what writers say they're doing about their own work, because they don't know what they're doing. So I know Molope and Mohamed slightly differently talk about their projects as one of writing into visibility, writing into being, right? And of course they do that. But I wonder whether they aren't also doing certain work around, as you say, the mnemonic work, but isn't really significantly about doing certain feminist work in relation to heroic masculinity. Right? If we think about heroic masculinity as one of the legitimizing ways in which you enter proper visibility in the memory of struggle and legitimate nation and legitimate activism, right? And of course, part of what African feminist literary criticism has the tradition in which you work and I work has problematized that constant construction of the impossibility of the heroic woman activists, right? So it has to be heroic masculinity. So I wonder whether part of what, you know what I'm saying? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Is it making sense now?
Yes. Yes.
So answer.
It's making sense in that I think you are kind of right. It's something I haven't thought about in particular this particular one. But one of the other papers that Habiba has done has helped me a lot in thinking through that paper is where I look at Filson, the soldier. And in that case, I think Habiba was pushing me to say that because on one hand she feels like she's just this feminine person, but then she feels like she's a menace. And in there, that ambivalence comes out very clearly with that character. And I try and it was very problematic for me to say what you're trying to say, because it was like, okay, what is it? Is this something about heroic masculinity? Is this what she wants to achieve? Or is it another form of femininity? So I struggled with that, but I hadn't related it to the young girls in this in dancing and in Mohammed. And it's a larger project, and it's something that you're pushing me as well to look at and think through.
Can I also say some stuff about in regards to your papers, because we did do this panel initially at Nest earlier this year at Wits, and one of the things that intrigued me about the panel was there was this element of girlhood in each paper. Nobody had planned this, but even with you speaking about the abduction of the girls and the responses to the girls even in Nigeria, and what got me on that was when when Fanon says in Black Skin, White Mask that we've all one of our commonalities is that we've all kind of suffered through childhood, right? And the ways in which we are all struggling to still deal with childhood in all of these different ways. I feel like I'm perpetually stuck in this 12-year-old body and trying to negotiate the entire world as a 12-year-old. And there are times I feel I have the skills, and at times I really don't have the skills, and I just want to go home to my bed. And then I think about someone like Michael Jackson and how my perception of him changed when I heard that song and saw that video, Have You Seen My Childhood? And it just made me it really made me hurt for someone wondering what it must have been like to miss that childhood and to have the kind of dysfunctional childhood that he had when they became famous. And so that interest in girlhood, because when I read Catcher in the Rye, that I found it one of the most irritating books in the world, and because I thought, well, it's this little boy who's navel-gazing and he's in boarding school, and the whole book is actually about the fact that he's going to get expelled from boarding school, and that's his big dilemma. And I couldn't connect to anything. And then the moment, the first time I read Tsitsi Dangaremba's nervous condition and found myself in there, or elements of myself, it was such a huge release. And so maybe I'm asking some of the panelists to maybe talk to this idea about how come so much of our vulnerabilities are located in those little girlnessness, and I just made up that word, and doesn't matter, and what version of that girly self are you struggling with at this point?
Like autobiographically?
No, I mean it's a panel on vulnerability, so like you need to get a little bit vulnerable. You can't just talk through your textual characters.
Can I respond? I'm responding, Sharlene, maybe indirectly to what you're asking, but just a thought that occurred to me that I'm in a place where I'm rethinking my experiences as a girl, because now I've got a girl and I'm parenting a girl, and I'm aware that our lives are so different. Hers is much more. She's able to say things I was never able to say. She has a relationship with me that I never could have with my mother because of the distance that existed between my mother and myself, because of the way in which they parented, and also because I spent a lot of it in boarding school. So I'm aware that it needs to be different, that what's happening now has to be different, and also because of the times in which she lives. I can't afford to be coy or to be the same kind of parent that my mother was or had to be when I was growing up. Yes.
Can I have a follow-up question to that? Just what you said, because if we you have a daughter, you have a daughter, you have a daughter, and so daughters, yes, in plural, and we raising them up to be, they're being raised by feminist mothers, and that's wonderful, but it also comes with its own burdens, because in a heteronormative school, it comes when they challenge those, they become ostracized, they can be othered, they can be set apart. So how do you deal with the challenge? And then if your child is going through that, and then you hurt all over again, and that comes back to when you were a girl and how you negotiated. How do you negotiate that sense of?
Grace was parented with all of us, she can answer this.
Oh gosh, I see the people you get for friends. Something about your question, Sharlene, and I completely agree with you about laughter as a form of survival, as a weapon of survival. And I think for many of us, we can relate to when you just have to laugh because it's much, right? It's macho, so you laugh. But coming back to, so as you're speaking, you know where my mind went? It went to this phenomenon of her, and she's a pastor's child. do you know that setup?
Yeah.
Of the expectations and the pressures of, and the father is a pastor and the mother is religious, and look how they turned out. So I wonder, and I'm not escaping the question, but I wonder whether we see that at some point around feminist parenting or children raised by feminist parents, and I see it. I experience it at an intellectual level when I look at the young people I work with and I'm trying to raise to be feminist, and then I see them do a U-turn and decide, no, I'm not a feminist, and this whole feminist thing is overdone and it's much and we're done, and so I'm not, because there was a moment there, and I feel like those pastors must have felt when their children just do a U-turn and go off circuit. So, but I don't know. So that thought came to mind. But
Sorry, Sharlene, I really need to ask this question for the normalization of things which are not normal, right? When I had your paper, it's nice, but it's almost like I could also normalize it more than when I watched the movie Beasts of a Nation, right? And the little boy gets raped in that scene, and I'm just like, woo, I can't take this. But I've seen a lot of movies where little girls get raped. So my question goes like then, because I remember then and I was like, if my boy had to come back and tell me that this has happened, I think I would have a different, like, I don't know, it was just so overwhelming. I just couldn't finish the movie. So it's like, my question is like, how much of your work also deals with little boys that go through that space, and the kind of people they grow up to be, and who do they talk to? Because it's become like, it's almost like accepted, or we are not accepted, or I don't know, let's say accepted, like, or normalized that girls do get raped and whatnot. But boys, it's just like, I don't know how to deal with someone telling me they rape now, which goes back to your statement. It's like, what's the right way to deal with it when someone says, yeah, I got raped, or do I cry with you, do I hug you? And then it goes back to like, now when it's a boy and they're like, I'm 8 and this is happening, and they don't know whether they should talk about it. I mean, that boy's face, like after he's been raped in that movie, is just like so hectic. It's just like, whew, you know? So like, how much of that do you incorporate in your work? Because that's abnormal and it's accepted as abnormal, and I think that's why it triggers such a more hectic feeling in me, you know?
Can we just take the question at the back and then you guys can respond?
It's called Grace. I live on the internet. It's a very popular kind of interpretation, what word now, of the meme thing. And that is a contemporary form of Dadaism. So it's this environment of disillusionment. And the response to that is then those kinds of memes.
All right. I suppose that was for me, right? Well, look, I haven't thought about boys in this context, but I have thought about childhood and the question that Sharlene is asking. So I will answer. The short version of my answer is I will not answer it as boy, but I'll think about it as child. Because to me, yes, we are exposed to multiple narratives of girls who are abused. But I think what stuck with me with all the both novels and reading through these novels was that these were children, and all of them, except one, I think, is abused, sexually abused by an adult man in full participation of other adults, including the mothers. In the sense that the mothers notice, but then they decide they want to keep the peace, so they don't confront the men. So for me, I think the more useful way of thinking about it would be to think about what this vulnerability looks like for the child. So you're thinking more as the person engaging with that. You're engaging with this with this text. But I suppose I'm coming at it more in terms of that, and the fact that this person is a child, for me already just completely messes with my head. Right? Danai was telling me a horrible story which I will save all of you from. I will not recount it, but these things that happen to our children in public spaces. So I suppose my roundabout way of thinking about it is how then do we visualize, which again links to your question, how then do we think about what that vulnerability means for this child and the fact that they have to continue to live their lives?
Within a gender construct. Within a gender construct.
Well, I am escaping, I'm running away from that categorization for now. But maybe we can talk about it over tea.
Okay.
So I'm just thinking, for me, can we think about that vulnerability as a space from which to reorganize and re-energize? I don't know.
I wonder whether... So that example reminds me of the phenomenon of white beggars.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, I'm PC, but I'll put it on the table. Because there's a way in which we've normalized black precarity, black poverty, that we can live with black bodies in dignity. But the sight of a white body in indignity just messes with many of us. And I have endless examples of people from elsewhere on the continent being pickpocketed by white beggars in Joburg and being so stunned. Like, they're not even upset. Like, a white person mugged me, wow. So I think there might be a bit of that going on there with the amount of empathy we're able to mobilize towards male victims of sexual violence, which is not as much, or it's a different quality of empathy compared to what we're able to mobilize towards female victims of sexual violence. And I think there needs to be a conversation there, which is not the same as saying it's okay. I happen to know one or two male survivors of violence, both physical and sexual violence, so I know it's not. But I also catch myself feeling more troubled by it, and that just, so I don't know what to do with that. But I also had a quick comment for Danai and Nwabisa, and this is both your author and both Danai's work and Vangi's work seems to me to abscond the responsibility of cushioning the reader from the hecticity of what they're about to deliver. I don't have language for it. But this ordinary, I think many of the conventional creative material we're exposed to the writers tend to do that labor for us. They cushion us a bit. But reading your material and listening to you talk about these three texts, there's that sense of actually, I'm not going to cushion it for you. I'll put it on the table. Boom, deal with it. Okay, and
the last comment and then the end? Aida? Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. I think you can grab a very quick cup of tea on your way to the next session.